When a football club faces financial difficulty, it results in the club falling behind, and if push comes to shove, eventually they end up being relegated. But for Palace, their situation was far different and were facing a fate far worse than any ordinary relegation. When Crystal Palace entered into administration, club revenues collapsed, creditors got nervous, and the club were facing upwards of £27 million in debt. But let me tell you where the real problem lies. See, most clubs in football have some form of debt, but here's the key difference. Debt comes in two flavors, short-term and long-term debt. Long-term debt allows the club to plan ahead and is manageable, but short-term debt, that's a major problem. Palace, through unpaid player contracts and much more, were facing difficulties paying off their short-term debt. Their cash flow was so low they couldn't even cover interest payments on their short-term liabilities. This ultimately became the main driving factor into why the club entered into administration. But the situation goes beyond just financial difficulties. According to football rules in the Championship back in 2010, when Palace entered into administration, this triggered an automatic 10-point deduction, and as a result, the club were dragged from mid-table all the way back down to a relegation dogfight. Administration didn't just financially cripple the club, it turned the club on its head. Players were sold below market value, notably the departure of Victor Moses to Wigan Athletic, as well as the club being forced into making staff redundancies just to keep the club afloat. The club had dug a hole so deep, liquidation became a serious possibility. If something wasn't done fast, the club would have been wiped off the face of the map. The club were a mess, and with the looming threat of liquidation, all hope seemed lost. But everything changed when Steve Parish stepped into the footballing game. Parish had been a lifelong Palace fan and had built a reputation for turning small, undervalued businesses into global brands. Back in the early 2000s, he transformed a small printing company into a global leader in marketing production services. Using the Red Bull tactic, he rebranded the entire company, and by the early 2000s, the company had been renamed TAG Worldwide. Steve Parish didn't plan on sitting back and watching his one and only boyhood club disappear off the face of the map, but stepping into the footballing game would prove to be his toughest challenge yet. Despite his earlier success in business, he didn't have the finances to complete a full takeover. He knew something needed to be done, but he couldn't do it alone, so he turned to his allies. With the help of Martin Long, Stephen Browade, and Jeremy Hosking, these were the four men that formed a consortium known as the CPFC 2010. This consortium was all that stood between the club's last hope for survival and liquidation. The message was clear. Failure was not an option. Negotiations were tense, but administrators were willing to sell the club to the CPFC 2010. But there was still one major problem. By 2010, it had been 12 years since Crystal Palace had owned their home ground stadium, Selhurst Park. The stadium had been the club's home ground since 1924. The club's stadium had been owned by a public company known as Lloyds Bank, and they weren't keen on selling the stadium. Owning Selhurst Park became essential in completing a full takeover. Without the stadium, the takeover doesn't happen. The CPFC 2010 didn't have the money to even tempt the bank owners into selling the stadium, and they weren't keen on overpaying for the stadium either. Talks dragged on for weeks. Day by day, the fans were praying for a miracle, but in reality, as each day passed, the club were nearing its impending doom. But it wasn't over just yet. Steve Parish created an account on a Crystal Palace fan forum under the username CPFC 2010, and he made a post explaining the club's dire financial situation. He was honest, transparent, and prayed for a miracle that something would come through. By late May, the deal came close to collapsing, but everything changed when a group of Palace supporters who had seen Steve Parish's post on the club's fan forum came marching down the city of London and began protesting at Lloyds Bank. The message was clear from the fans as they chanted, "You let this club die and you will never live it down." This was a club built around its community, and when the club needed the most, the fans came through. The sudden public pressure from the fans and even news outlets began mounting. The bank, not knowing what to do, were forced into re-entering negotiations with the CPFC 2010 consortium. The 5 difficult months of fear and frustration, on the 1st of June 2010, a deal was struck. The CPFC 2010 completed a full takeover, owning not just the club but Selhurst Park as well. On that day, football had finally won, but remember, this was only one half of the battle that had been won. During the same time the club were dealing with administration, in the background the club were fighting a completely different battle in relegation. The club weren't just fighting relegation, they had to do it with a significantly weakened squad. With no money to spend on transfers in the January transfer window, the club had to make use of bargain deals in the free transfer market. Fast forward to March and the club just couldn't catch a break. Their manager Neil Warnock stepped down from his position as manager, and at this point he just had to feel for Palace fans. Despite this move coming as a shock, the fans were understanding and didn't hold it against him. After all, when Neil Warnock stepped down as Crystal Palace manager, he joined QPR, and as a result the club did receive $500,000 in compensation. The focus for Palace then shifted towards finding a new manager, and the club settled on Paul Hart as Neil Warnock's successor. Fast forward to the last day of the season, and Crystal Palace only needed a draw to pull off the ultimate comeback. After a nervy 2-2 draw, Palace had finally pulled it off. The club had survived one of the worst financial crises in recent football history, but now the real work had begun for the CPFC 2010. Crystal Palace now had a new objective in mind: return the club to the top flight of English football, but this would prove to be no easy feat. In the next 2 seasons, Palace continued to rebuild, focused on cutting costs and bringing in players through their youth academy, and by 2013 Palace had finally done it. After 8 long years in the Championship, the club were now back in the Premier League thanks to a 1-0 win in the playoff final. Ian Holloway was the man responsible for guiding the club back to the top flight. Crystal Palace kicked off their first Premier League season in less than ideal fashion. They lost academy graduate Wilfred Zaha to Manchester United for a then club record fee of £15 million. Zaha played a vital role in securing promotion, scoring 2 goals in the semi-finals, but it wasn't just that. Zaha became the first academy graduate in over 4 years to truly make his mark on the first team back in 2013. This not only proved that Crystal Palace were building an elite academy, but paved the way for future academy graduates. When he eventually left for Manchester United, Palace played a smart and strategic move, using the money they got from their record sale to rebuild the squad. It wouldn't be a far stretch to say that without the sale of Zaha, Palace wouldn't have gained promotion to the Premier League. At the start of the 2013-14 Premier League season, Palace were tipped as favourites for relegation. The Premier League was a different beast compared to the Championship. By 2013, only 9 out of the 21 playoff final winners had managed to stay in the Premier League in their first season following promotion. In Palace's first 8 Premier League games, they amassed 7 defeats, and those earlier Premier League predictions for relegation were looking spot on. Everything changed when Ian Holloway made a massive call. He left the club by mutual consent, explaining that he had been exhausted, so the board brought in Tony Pulis as his replacement in hopes of a change in results, and that's exactly what happened. Palace ended the season in 11th place through playing defensively solid football, as teams had a tough time breaking them down. This horrible brand of football somehow won Tony Pulis manager of the season, but fair play to him for guiding Crystal Palace from the depths of relegation to comfortable Premier League survival. But this is the part where our story takes a turn. 2 days before Palace kicked off their second Premier League season, Tony Pulis left the club by mutual consent in a shocking twist. But the question is, why did he do it? Let's not forget, this is the same guy who was arguably the best manager in the prior campaign, so why all of a sudden was he leaving? It was revealed that Tony Pulis grew frustrated by Palace's lackluster summer transfer window and opted to leave the club as a show of respect. Though his departure came as a shock, there was no bad blood between him and chairman Steve Parish, as the two left on good terms. Parish now left scrambling, trying to find a new manager, settled on reappointing the same guy who left the club by mutual consent during its most challenging period, Neil Warnock. The fans were initially underwhelmed by this appointment, as they saw it as a short-term fix rather than a long-term solution. It came as no surprise as the fans were proven right, as Warnock lasted less than 5 months in the job after a run of bad results. 3 wins in 17 games is abysmal for a Premier League manager, and to add the cherry on top, he left the club in the relegation zone. It was back to the drawing board for Steve Parish, only this time the pressure was on. He knew he needed to get his next managerial appointment right, because if he didn't, it would mean complete disaster for the club. He didn't disappoint, pulling off the steal of the season when he convinced Alan Pardew to join Crystal Palace from Newcastle United. Alan Pardew had a more than promising enough track record to excite the fans, as he led Newcastle United to European football during his time at Newcastle. This appointment showed a certain level of intent and ambition from the Palace board, but they weren't done just yet. By this time, Wilfried Zaha had returned to the club on loan, so the board decided to make his deal permanent as he joined from Manchester United for a cut price fee of £3.8 million. The way Palace pulled off this deal was one for the history books, selling their best academy graduate for a club record fee, then bringing Zaha back to the club for a fraction of the price. This move was genius. Following the purchase of Zaha, Alan Pardew guided the club from relegation to a top 10 finish in less than 6 months. This success laid the groundwork for the following season, as there was a higher expectation for the club to succeed. Palace weren't just seeing success on the pitch. Off the pitch, they were financially thriving. By 2014, Palace had recorded the highest operating profit margin of any English team. Get this, they had doubled that of their nearest challenger, Manchester United. This stat alone showcases the work that Parish and the rest of the Palace board had put in to ensure that the club were firing at all cylinders. In the 2015-16 season, Pardew was facing an uphill battle. Tactically, he began struggling adapting his style of play to fit the squad, as the players were more suited to a defensive style of play. Add the club's lack of reinforcements in the summer transfer window, combined with frequent departures on free transfers, and you're looking at a really difficult season ahead for the manager. Even though Palace broke the bank, signing Johan Cabaye for a club record fee of almost £14 million, Alan Pardew still felt that this wouldn't be enough heading into the new season, and the results speak for themselves. Despite starting the season well, Palace would go on to finish the season in 15th place, 5 points away from the relegation zone. This was a total disaster considering the expectations from the prior season, but it wasn't over just yet. Somehow Alan Pardew led the club to their first FA Cup final in 26 years. For Palace, this was more than just a final. This was a chance to win the club's first major trophy in the club's 110-year history. Despite taking a 1-0 lead in the final, Palace would eventually go on to lose that match 2-1 to Manchester United. For Palace, the wait for their first major trophy continued. But what if I told you that the biggest controversy wasn't Palace losing the game, but it instead had to do with their manager? Pardew was caught in 4K dancing on the sidelines after Palace took a 1-0 lead in the game. This moment wasn't just seen as a disregard for the opponent, but it eventually came back to haunt him when Palace went on to lose the game. Losing the FA Cup final wasn't just seen as a failure, but it broke the dressing room psychologically, and the cracks started showing the following season. The 2016-17 season marked a turnaround in the club's spending. After scraping relegation in the prior campaign, the club went all out, spending a jaw-dropping £100 million on new arrivals. The arrival of Christian Benteke and Andros Townsend had fans full of optimism for the upcoming campaign. However, the Premier League campaign started in complete disaster, with the club winning 4 games in 17 Premier League matches. By late December, Alan Pardew was sacked as manager. One of the reasons that inevitably led to his sacking was his inability to finish off matches. Rather than grinding out results with defensive performances, he opted his teams to be on the front foot, and this resulted in the team losing crucial points. Parish this time opted for a more defensive-minded manager to steer the club away from relegation relegation and chose Sam Allardyce as the man for the job. The gamble on Allardyce paid off as the club survived yet again another season in the Premier League. Fast forward to 2020 and Palace were a mid-tier, well-established Premier League team. So the club took the next step in their evolution by reinvesting £20 million to revamp their training academy. This gave the club a Category 1 academy status, allowing the club to bring through more academy graduates and transition them to the first team. This not only strengthened the squad, but brought another stream of revenue for the club. And in the 2021 and 2022 season, despite the club finishing in the bottom half of the table, Palace pulled in record revenues. Through new sponsorship deals, matchday income, and commercial revenue, the club brought in a total of £116 million in revenue, and this number only continued to grow throughout the years. Despite all the commercial success Palace had gained up till this point, there was still one piece missing in the puzzle. The club was still yet to win their first major trophy in the club's 120-year history. This was something that had always haunted the fans. Despite making multiple finals throughout the years, Palace was still yet to get over the line. In 1990, ironically, they lost the FA Cup final to the same side that beat them in 2016, Manchester United. But in 2025, Palace were a different breed. After beating Aston Villa 3-0 in the FA Cup semi-finals, Palace had a date with destiny. They once again had another chance to right the wrongs of their past, only this time they met a different team from Manchester in the final. It wasn't Manchester United, but rather this time they met their city rivals Manchester City. You couldn't have picked a better team for Palace in the final. Yes, City had the better team on paper, but Palace on multiple occasions had gotten the better of Pep's City. On the day of the final, Palace took a 1-0 lead through starman Emerichi Eze, and that's all it took. Palace, after years of failed attempts, won their first major trophy in the club's 120-year history. That'll be it from me. If you guys did like the video, click subscribe, and if you want more videos like this, check this one out.